Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Rush Developmental webinar with Jen Fraser. Apologies for the delay. Dr. Fraser talked me through and he'll ask for me, and she made me turn off my computer and reboot everything that's late. Without any further ado, Dr. Fraser, thanks for joining us. Please tell us about your journey.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
I can.
We're having
You're
some
going
technical
in and
issues
out a
still, but
little
I
bit.
think
Can you
Dr.
hear me?
Fraser.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. So should I just launch into the story?
Yes.
Okay. Well, as you and I have
Please
discussed,
do.
and we as you and I have discussed, Chris, and as we both feel really passionate about, we are really ready for a change in coaching, a change in sport, a change in the way in which youth athletes play. And the reason I became so interested in this was I was working at a private school, and I had worked there for 8 years very, very happily. And I loved the kids, I loved my colleagues, and I believed in the administration, and it was an amazing experience. This is a university prep school. It has 250 international students there at any given time that live in boarding. It's just a wonderful place. And this is on the west coast of Canada. And over a series of months, we started to realize that there was something very wrong with the way in which the basketball coaching was happening. But it's that confusing phase you get in, I think, as a parent, where, you know, they weren't just teachers or coaches. For me, they were also my colleagues. And so, I mean, as a teacher myself, I'm so understanding of the job and how stressful it is. I mean, I was a theater director with young people, and it's the same sort of pressure you have on you as a coach when you're a teacher who's coaching, because the performance sort of reflects back on you. And I mean, I get all that stuff. But in February, a family, so this is 2012, in February, a family informed me that the coach, who was a colleague of mine, had called the students, the student athletes, and I won't say it online in front of everyone in case I distress your webinar people, but the teacher called the students effing retards. And I was really shocked, of course, and I consulted with my son, who was on the team, and I said, is this for real? This is February. Were you guys really called this? And he said, yeah. And I counseled the parent, and I said, you know what? Teachers do stupid things sometimes. They lose it. They say things they regret. Like, give them a chance. I said, the administration is not particularly good at how they handle these things. Let's just see what happens. I'm sure the teacher's sorry, and, you know, this will get fixed. And so time went on. I understand there was some kind of an apology. Time went on. And it was now a month or so later, the team was at the provincial championships, and a student texted his parent, his mom, and just said, I can't take it anymore. They're calling us effing pathetic, effing embarrassments, lots of homophobic slurs. You got to start to build those in, because I can't say them online. And I was just, for me, that was the final straw. I'm just like, you don't ever talk to kids like that. There's never an excuse for it. It doesn't matter what your sport is or what you're doing or what course you're teaching. It's just no place for it. And so that's when the whole situation began, because I was caught in a whole variety of ways. My son was a player on the team. These were my colleagues. This was my job on the line. But, you know, I cannot work at a place where students are talked to that way. So what happened was, just to take a very long story and shorten it up, basically what happened was I learned step by step that the whole system really, and I confirm this with multiple families that I've worked for over the course of the last 5-6 years all across America. The system is designed, in fact, to protect the person that's being very abusive, that's using bullying behaviors. Our system is not properly geared up to actually address the situation in a healthy, productive way. So what happens is, the person who's the perpetrator oftentimes suffers a huge amount. The victims suffer a huge amount. The institution suffers. I mean, it's just an absolute disaster, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so as you and I discussed, there's so much opportunity to turn this whole system inside out and redo how we handle bullying and abuse from the very beginning in a very proactive way. And this is why I draw on the neuroscience, because I felt like the administrators at the school, other parents, the students themselves, and the teachers really didn't understand that when you are using homophobic slurs, when you are swearing at kids, when you're using lots of fear and humiliation and ostracizing and favoritism, you actually are doing such serious damage to these young people's brains that it can't be dismissed, it can't be denied. None of those responses are acceptable. I mean, if you were taking a club and hitting these kids in the head, you'd go to jail. Well, you're doing as serious damage, the research shows, when you are using homophobic slurs, using fear, using threats, using humiliation, especially humiliation, public shaming. It does unbelievable damage to brains. So that's what I've been working on. I've been trying to say, hey, my colleagues don't know this. Coaches don't know this. I didn't know it until I started looking at what the neuroscientists are doing in their laboratories. And now that I know, I feel really strongly that we have to get this information out there, and all of us need to start talking about it.
Yeah, and I think you draw on some huge things there, Dr. Fraser. Is it okay to call you Jen, or do you prefer Dr. Fraser?
Please call me Jen.
Okay, thanks, Jen. And I think, you know, the things that you touch upon there are so huge, right? The colleagues, your colleagues and our coaching colleagues, they don't know any different. And they're probably doing it because that's what they went through, number one. The second thing is winning masks everything. So if it's okay if people are winning, but what we don't realize is in fact the scars and the things that are going on. And when we look at teenagers in sport, there's no mistake why 75% of teenagers are dropping out of sport, number one. Number two, teenage suicides are second only cause of death to car crashes. So, you know, we have to take notice, and we have to know that our words carry weight. You know, as we were talking offline, you know, before I did the reset, we talked about, you know, children getting one childhood. And I think with your work and your research that you've done and the look into neuroscience, I think you'd be able to give the coaches on and the coaches that will watch this at a later date some foundations and some ideas of, hey, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. And what I've always tried to say in our work is, if it's acceptable in the classroom, then it's acceptable on the field. However, there are practices going on in the classroom, right? And the teachers and the coaches are, in fact, at times the worst bullies. You know, so, but thanks for sharing your story. And, you know, I first heard this story, I think, with Johnny O'Sullivan. And you were called in actually, right, to clean up on aisle 7, as it were, right, the situation, and look into the whole school thing. Can you let's go, let you lead us, I'll follow, take us wherever you want to go, and share with us just, you know, some of the most alarming things that you saw, right? But the picture that stayed with me is a coach or a teacher using a club to whack a child, right? Physically would go to jail for that, but you know, we do it on a daily basis, and we don't realize, you know, the damage we're doing per se. So
yeah, so I think the best example of this that really hits home for people, it happened last year, and I'm sure you know about it, but there was a football player, a new football player, just come into university at University of Maryland, and his name was Jordan McNair, and he was treated in the same way that my son and these students were treated on the basketball team. Namely, they were lambasted with homophobic slurs. They were constantly treated as if they were weak and lazy and embarrassments, and it was all affiliated with this sort of hatred towards women. You know, everything to do with women was sort of symbolic of weakness and revulsion and these sorts of things. So what I really like about what you just said is, what we have to do is look at this way in which young people are treated. Then we have to take a look at what we're seeing in our youth populations. We're seeing unbelievably high level of suicide. We are also seeing high levels of anxiety and depression and very high levels of young people dropping out of sport. So we can keep telling ourselves, I mean, the coach Durkin, he can tell himself, he's just being hired at another university. He can keep telling everybody he wants that his methods, first of all, did not result in the death of Jordan McNair. Jury's out. I mean, if you drive a young person to go against their own physical symptoms, that their body is in extreme distress, as this young man was, he was barely able to stand, and you don't get them medical help, and you treat them as if this is somehow a moral flaw, that they can't hold their body up in high levels of heat anymore. I mean, to my mind, that type of coercion, that type of humiliation is absolutely deadly. I mean, you work with young kids, I work with youth as well, and they are so susceptible to the authority in the room. They will do whatever you tell. They'll do anything to try and please you as a coach, as a parent. And so you have a massive amount of responsibility. You have a massive power imbalance. When this person has only been on the planet for 19 years, you've got a huge advantage because you've seen a lot of stuff. You've done a lot of things. You've had a huge amount of education and experience. Young people don't have that. And so, I mean, what I find really fascinating is you take the Jordan McNair situation, the trainers and the coach, they weren't even fired. They were brought right back in as if nothing had happened. They were, can you imagine those football players face to face with these men who they witnessed drive this young man into the ground and then stood by and ignored him while he was essentially in the first stages of death? And that university brought them back. I mean, if it was an adult in an adult workplace, there is no way, if someone died on your watch as an administrator, as a boss, as a leader of a company, you would be walking. You'd be walking with your computer shut down and escorted out of the building. If you're a coach and you're dealing with youth, somehow you don't even lose your job when a kid dies on your watch and it's actually correlated with homophobic slurs and violent verbal language and humiliation. I just find it mind-blowing.
I think some people call that character building.
Well, I mean, so going back to your point,
Yeah.
Character building, how come our kids are so anxious? How come they're so depressed? How come they don't want to play sports? And how come they're killing themselves? I don't see any grit or resilience in youth populations. Maybe we need to press reset and do things differently.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's so profound there, right? And the comment that I have for all the coaches on and all the people that will listen to this later is, you know, be upstanders, not bystanders. I have 3 teenage sons, and I tell them that they can respectfully challenge authority, but the key word is respectfully. And it's not in front of an audience, it's one-on-one. As our club, we have 11 human core values, and you know, there's joking, there's ribbing that goes on, there's banter, as some people like to call it. But I've also instructed my children to go, hey, you can call me out as your dad, but you can also call out the adults, and you can say, okay, what core value are we exemplifying right now? But don't do it in front of a crowd. And you know, respectful is the key word, right? Finding that the right time. And but I think that's character building, right? Now you're standing up to the bully or the verbal abuser, and stuff like that, you know. And if we were to take and hold our breath, you know, for the people we lost in concentration camps, and many people saw that, we'd be silent for over 11.5 years. You know, so is that where we want to go, especially with the epidemic of anxiety, depression, suicides, the dropout in sport? You know, what advice, you know, do you give coaches that are witnessing this, or players that, you know, see these kind of behaviors?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up concentration camps, because some of the most interesting research on this was done a long time ago by Dr. Stanley Milgram. And what he did was, he's a Yale University psychologist, and he looked at authority. And so they did this experiment, and it's interesting because they set it up like a school. So they took regular people off the street, normal people, they brought them in, they said to them, hey, this guy with the white jacket on is an educational authority, and there is a patient in a room behind the glass that you can see, and they're hooked up to this electrical machine. So if they get the answer wrong, we're trying to test, how can we motivate them? So we want you to give them a little electric shock. So they had a dial, and the dial showed that, if you keep raising the electric shock, you get to a point where it's actually harmful to the person. And then you get to the point on their dial where it was like life-threatening. It was so dangerous. And so the person that came off the street is given the electric dial. Dr. Stanley Milgram had actors play the people that were getting zapped with electricity. So they weren't really getting zapped with electricity, but they were actors, and they portrayed people who were getting electrocuted. And then the authority figure was also in on the research, and that would be played by Milgram or someone else. And they would keep encouraging the person on the street. They'd keep giving them directives, and they followed the same directives. You need to give them a shock. They got the answer wrong. Please give them a shock. I'm asking you as an authority, please give them a shock, this sort of thing. What they found was unbelievably high percentage of people, they don't know this authority. And Milgram was fascinated with the Holocaust. He was looking at how do normal people get coerced, get told what to do, to the point where they will murder children. They'll murder their neighbors. They will betray these people. How does that happen? And Milgram confirmed in his research, and it was replicated many times, that we as human beings, we adults will do what we're told. So imagine our kids. You've got 3 teenagers. I've got a teenager now and a 24-year-old. When they're young, when they're in those malleable adolescent years, when they're younger even, but in those teenage years, they will do anything to conform. The one thing they do not want is to have any social issues. Their brain is wired for them to socially develop themselves and have a standing in their peer group, have a standing with the adults in their world that are important. They will do anything to avoid humiliation, anything. And so, again, let's look at some of the youth behaviors that we see. We see young men, young athletes oftentimes, who are being very, very sexually violent with the young women in their world. Look at the way they might be exposed to homophobic verbal violence in sports. If they're constantly bombarded with the fact that women are sort of disgusting and pathetic and weak, and they have to show how virile and strong and amazing they are, what's the best way to do it but to get that female presence away from you, like objectify it? It's not a person, it's just a sickening thing that you don't want near you, because the powerful men in your life are going to know that. They're going to know that you've got this weakness. So we have to start, I think, when you say, what should we say to coaches? I think what we have to do is, all of us adults, we have to start looking at the big picture and not just repeating to ourselves the same mantra over and over again, like, I was coached this way, I was taught this way, my dad or my mom parented me this way, I'm going to do it to my kids, I'm going to do it to my students, and it's character building. We have to stop saying that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, huge there, right? So give us examples of what you found, that obviously it's a shift, right? So it's a paradigm shift. We've got the old school, we've got the new school, we've got, this is the way I was coached, this is the way I was parented, this is, but, when we look at, I'm sure your 2 children are very different, even though they've come from the same, heritage. I have 3 boys and they're all very, very different. And I think it just goes back to, we have to know who's in front of us, and we have to know, what is potentially damaging. We've got to know the difference between right and wrong. And we have to, I think Charles Handy said it once, was instead of what is needed, instead of having a curriculum, what is needed is a curriculum for every child per se, right? So knowing who needs the arm around the shoulder, who needs those, but at the end of the day, I don't think anybody really enjoys being yelled at, or grabbed by the face, Max. Oh, hey, Fraser, you're just not getting the numbers in today. Well, you know what I mean? What are your thoughts?
One of the things I think you can do as a teacher or a parent or as a coach is say to yourself, I'm in a big power imbalance. So one of the ways we can trip ourselves up or catch ourselves is to say, would I grab my boss or my marriage partner or my friend by the mask and yell in their face? Like, when I go out and have a beer with my buddy at the bar, am I going to start swearing in his face and calling him homophobic slurs? No. Why? Like, I want him to have a good, strong character. I want my wife to have a good character, or my husband to have a good character. I want my boss or the leader of my company, the principal of my school, or the athletic director, I want them to have really good character. So how come I'm not yelling in their face? How come I'm putting them down and noticing every little thing they do wrong and screaming at them and shaming them, publicly shaming them? Like, why don't I not use those techniques? I mean, look at professional athletes. The professional athletes that spoke up after Mike Rice was exposed at Rutgers University using homophobic slurs on his players was powerful. You know, top athletes in the world spoke up and said, if anyone ever spoke to my kid like that, that'd be the end. Like, there is no way. That is not coaching. Let's not try and cover that up as anything to do with character building or sport excellence. There is not a single piece of replicated, peer-reviewed, consensus-building research out there. There is not a single researcher that will put their name to an article or a study that claims that humiliation and favoritism and swearing and ostracizing or ignoring or refusing to give feedback or throwing your clipboard down or yelling in the face of a player will get you results. However, there's a huge amount of research out there that is psychological, psychiatric, and neuroscientific, and it shows, and it's to coaches and athletes. It's not other people, it's coaches and athletes. And it shows that when you care about your athlete, you see your athlete as a person, not just some sort of performance metric. You see them as a person who needs your mentoring. You believe in them no matter what happens. If they make a mistake, you believe in them. If they get sick, you believe in them. If they get an injury, you believe in them. You never stop thinking that they are going to fulfill their potential, whatever that's going to be. And you care about them as a friend. The research is clear. That's where you get spectacular results. So if you want to win, take a look at the research.
Actually care. If you want to win, actually care, right? I think it was the old Maya Angelou quote, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's proven in research. That's backed by a huge amount of research.
Yeah, we commonly see, my favorite one is coaches on the sideline, faces contorted with rage, and they're yelling, relax. Well, it's a bit hard to when your face is contorted with rage and stuff like that. What reading or, you know, what research, what pieces of research would you say that the coaches on this webinar and the people that will see this afterwards, what piece of research or research papers, what things, maybe it's the book, The Bullied Brain, what areas, what advice would you give to people on this? And you know, listen, you must read this paragraph or you must read this paper because this will change how we do things. This will change how we think.
Well, it's a great question, because I was exactly the same as anyone. I was a teacher, I was a mom, and I didn't know any of this research. When I got pulled into this situation, I started taking these student testimonies. The headmaster asked me to take student testimonies. So I sat in front of these teenagers and I wrote down everything they said, and they described to me what was happening. And I am a trained researcher. That's what my PhD is in comparative literature. So I'm trained not to have my own opinion, basically. I'm trained to go and see what do the experts say and then put it into dialogue and figure out, you know, a different way of doing things. So when I was listening to these students, I was so appalled by what they were telling me, but I didn't really know if it was serious or not. I was like, the headmaster is not taking it very seriously. He hasn't even suspended these people, the athletic director who was a woman and these 3 male coaches. Maybe it's not that serious. Maybe I'm blowing things out of proportion. Maybe I'm biased because my kid is one of the victims. So I went and looked at the research. And I would recommend to any coach, anybody who's listening to this, who's a parent, who cares, who's a teacher, the best things I read was Brainstorm is fantastic. That's Daniel Stiegel's work. I highly recommend Age of Opportunity. That's Dr. Lawrence Steinberg's work. The Teenage Brain by neuroscientist Frances Jensen fantastic book. If you're interested in the research and you really want to be sort of figure out, is my method, I mean, I was raised this way and I'm a successful person. I became a great athlete. Is this method going to be good with my kids? And you want to weigh it against the research, I would recommend those books. If you want to know more about really the system and how the system works, and then you want to see that put in the context of how out to lunch it is in contrast to the research, that's what my first book was about, Teaching Bullies. And I called it Teaching Bullies because I really wanted to look at the fact that it's the same thing as the coach on the sidelines yelling, relax. That coach means well, but the coach can't see that he himself is causing the stress. And that's the really hard thing with abuse and bullying. It is a system and it's a cycle. So if you've been badly bullied or abused yourself by an adult authority, a parent or a teacher or a university prof or your coach, chances are really good that you have normalized it. And in fact, when psychologists look at attachment fragmentation, which means you actually sever your ties, your natural, healthy, empathic ties with other human beings, and you start to affiliate yourself with a team or an institution if it's your school. When you have attachment fragmentation, you actually come to believe that the abuse that was done to you was the making of you. It's what made you strong. It's what gave you grit. It's what gave you character. So you want to pass it on. You're not doing it out of some sort of negative, hurtful drive. I mean, people don't want to do that to their kids or their students. But psychologically, what's happened is, I mean, again, I hope this isn't too much psychology, but if we align it, I'll find that this makes sense to people. Essentially, what we're dealing with is identification with the aggressor. So by the time you're an athlete who's been brutally abused and you believe it's the making of you, when you become a coach, you then are aligning yourself with the aggressor and you mimic how you were coached. And so you humiliate and you ostracize and you believe every step of the way that it's going to help the athlete become the best they can be. It's just that that's not how it works.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when we go that route, they do it in spite of you, not because of you. You know what I mean? And then the teenage numbers and all the things that you mentioned earlier. We've had our first couple of questions come in, Jen, and this one is from my very dear friend Matt Saul, and we were just talking about the structure of school yesterday and how industrial it was. And Matt's question is what is the impact of terminology coaches use with players? Even with the best of intentions, does sentence structure matter?
It's an interesting question, because one of the things I found was I received a lot of backlash for standing up for the students. So I resigned in protest from my job. I have a lot of colleagues who think I did a bad thing. I never should have reported, these sorts of things. And as soon as I tell people what was actually being said to the students, those sentences, you know, effing insert female genitalia, effing retards, effing pathetic, effing soft. When I use that language, so it's not really sentence structure, it's just the words themselves, then people go, oh, and they take a step back, because I think we can all agree, regardless of what we think is going to be effective coaching or not, I think we can all agree that using those types of phrases with anybody, let alone young people you have power over, is beyond the pale destructive. It doesn't produce anything healthy or strong or proud. And if you're not feeling healthy, strong, and proud, you're probably not playing your best as an athlete. In terms of sentence structure, I mean, I think, well, it's a really interesting question, because so I wrote an article about working out myself with a personal trainer. I had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis as a child, so I never played sports. I wasn't allowed. So I'm not that kind of an athlete, but I'm a runner and I do yoga, and I've always done sort of independent things like that. So I said to myself, this is it. I'm going to work out with a personal trainer. And I found it really, really hard. And so, you know, using the machines, very foreign to me, using muscles that I'd never used before, being in a public place and looking like a loser, like I just found it so tough. And then here you've got this personal trainer who's watching every single thing you do. And whenever I was struggling, he would say to me, come on, I know you can do it. He'd say, get your shoulders back. I believe it. I know you can do this. You know, hold your head high, kind of stuff like that. And so I wrote an article about it, because if he had said to me for 1 second, if he had said, you know what, you look like crap, you look lazy, what are you doing out there? Like, I don't like the look of that. I never, ever would have come back. I felt so jeopardized and so uncomfortable, and so I was trying so hard that one wrong word, I never would have gone back. But him encouraging me, I just kept giving it my all. Even if it wasn't great, I gave it my all. So
Yeah.
sentence structure, I think all of it matters.
Yeah, and the words, obviously, you know, our words have power. You know, I picked up there, you know, you were ostracized a little bit, as you said, from your colleagues, from parents, because you challenged structure and you challenged the imbalance of power. So whether it's a coach and a teacher, whether it's you're at coaching school and your instructor, you know, people still, I don't, you know, it's people sometimes don't realize the imbalance of power, but some people do, and they love to wield that power axe, as it were, kind of like He-Man's power sword. You know, how do we neutralize that power? How do we give the power and make it more child-centered and athlete-centered? You know, how do we get, so I'll give you an example real quick, Jen. So about 10 years ago, I was coaching, and what I did was I wanted to get away from using the word don't. I didn't want to have, like, don't miss the layup, don't miss this. So every time I said the word don't, the kids would stop the session and say, Coach, don't say don't. So that was a little way, you know, because I wanted to extenuate the positives. I didn't want to stop and correct the behaviors that I didn't want. I wanted to correct, you know, I wanted to give words of affirmation to the and not just empty praise to the behaviors that I wanted. So it was simply, instead of stand up and put your foot on the ball, it was, hey, for those of you with your foot on the ball, thank you so much. And invariably kids would want to go, oh, you know, I want to please. Do you know what I mean? So give us some ideas or stuff like that.
I think you just brilliantly answered your own question, because what I was going to say is, if you want athlete buy-in and if you want to dismantle power, then you need to talk to your athletes, and your athletes need to have absolute trust with you that whatever they say, however they feel, whatever they think you might be doing wrong, you're going to hear them and you're going to try and be better. And what's really interesting is that's the antithesis of bullying. So one of the things you find with the bullying personality, and they oftentimes in the research correlate that with narcissism. So whenever you say to the bully, hey, when you're behaving this way, it's very damaging, it hurts people, the bully will instantly flip that and say, how dare you call me out? How dare you victimize me? You are absolutely out of control. In other words, the victim is always the bully. The narcissist can only hear that they are exceptional, that they are wonderful, that they need to be praised at all time and flattered even. They can never hear criticism, and they are the last person. They are unable to say, hey, you made a good point there, and I did something wrong, and I'm really sorry. I guess I hurt you, and I didn't even mean to, and I'm so sorry. Those are not the words you will ever hear from an abusive or bullying individual. They believe, and they surround themselves with a coterie of people that believe that they are perfect. So, I mean, you look at Sandusky in prison, you look at Cosby, their wives will still defend them to the ends of the earth. Oh no, nothing ever happened. They never did anything wrong. They never hurt anybody. That's their wives, let alone them. That's a narcissistic thing. What you're doing is saying, I don't have to have the power. I want this to be an amazing relationship situation. I want you guys to make me be the best coach I can be. And I'm human, so I'm going to make mistakes. And I want you to be the best. So if I don't know you, if you can't speak up to me, if you can't come to practice and say, I don't feel well, then there's no relationship.
Yeah, huge. And I think that's huge, right? The relationship and the trust, which is huge. We've just had our second question come in, and this is from a lady called Debbie Scholes. She's a retired teacher, taught PE for many years, and she's done a little bit of studying of the brain. And her question is this. It says, what part of the brain is affected the most if bullied as a toddler by parents, and how does it affect future learning?
Well, so as I was saying before, when I started to take these student testimonies and started to get really worried about what I was hearing, and I went and looked at the research, the thing that upset me and frightened me the most as a teacher and as a parent was that when you bully and abuse a child, it does damage to all kinds of parts of the brain. It hurts the hippocampus. It demyelinates the brain. So our neural networks are covered in this kind of fatty insulation, and that's what makes us be able to think very quickly and execute athletic moves very quickly. We want to have highly myelinated neural networks. Well, bullying and abuse erodes those. It hurts the corpus callosum, which is the connector between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of the brain. It can kill neurons. It kills brain cells, and it can stop the growth of new brain cells. Like, it's unbelievable what bullying and abuse do to brains. And what the researchers have found out that is really interesting to me is what's happening is, as you all know, we're programmed to fight, to flight, or to freeze in the face of threats. In the face of threat, danger, violence of any kind, threat to social standing, humiliation, shame, all of these types of things are very threatening to us, especially when we're teenagers. Teenagers have a heightened sensitivity to all that stuff, and it's because of the way in which their brain is developing. And that's up until the age of 24. So people who coach university athletes need to know this information. So up until the age of 24, our brains are more neuroplastic. They have more neuroplasticity than older and more mature brains. And so they're susceptible to environment. They're susceptible to how they're treated in a really heightened way. So the damage can be that much more severe. So what I discovered, and this is why I've been on this quest to do as many talks, as many interviews, write as many articles, write another new book on the subject, is because in answer to your question, what I found out was bullying and abuse do rampant damage all over the brain, and it's because of the cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It's great if you want to run away from a saber-toothed tiger, but if it's constantly pumping up into your brain because you go to practice 6 days a week and your coaches treat you like you're some sort of a pathetic, disgusting, inhuman kind of person, that you're getting 6 days a week of damage done to your brain. It's like getting a repeated concussion. It's so bad.
Yeah, so I just wrote down there, actually, there's so much work now being done with concussion awareness, concussions, but that's something we're not doing, the verbal concussions, right? The verbal concussion of what we're doing, which is huge. And I think, teachers, parents, coaches, everybody, so questions come in there from Damien, my friend from Missouri. He said, is there a coach out there that you can point at that is doing it right? Who would be like a glowing example? And I think in the soccer world, I can answer that. You've got people like Jurgen Klopp, and you've got people like Pep Guardiola, who are really relationship builders. They're two that I can think of in the professional world. Is there anybody that you can think of, Jen, that you see coaches and you just go, man, he gets it or she gets it?
Two of the ones that I use in my own work, or I point to because they're well known and they correlate the research because they won at a very, very high level, is John Wooden, who, like me, is a literature teacher. He originally was teaching fiction, and parents will say, what's the best way that I can help my child develop strong empathy and really be able to get into the mindset of other people and understand what they're thinking and feeling? Well, one of the best ways to do that is with literature. Great literature draws you into the mindset of other people. So John Wooden, basketball coach, used that same technique with each player. Every single player he treated as a character in a novel. He wanted to get to know them. He wanted to know what made them tick, what motivated them, how to speak to them. And he changed it based on each individual player. And then another one that I think is really fascinating to me is Phil Jackson. So Phil Jackson worked really closely with George Mumford. And George Mumford, I highly recommend this book to coaches. It's fantastic. It's called The Mindful Athlete. So if we go back to the question from the teacher, what do we do when a child has been bullied, when they've suffered this kind of adult onslaught of dehumanizing treatment? One of the healthiest ways you can repair the brain, and the brain really repairs, it heals. It's not not as damage is done. Not at all. The brain is so powerful in terms of how it can think. One of the best ways is fitness. We want all our kids to stay in sports because, and again, I recommend Mark, Dr. John Rady. Exercise is one, and especially aerobic exercise, and especially sport, because it makes you think and move at the same time. It's a miracle drug for brains. The other one is mindfulness. So George Mumford taught mindfulness to Phil Jackson's players. So he taught mindfulness to Michael Jordan, and Michael Jordan used that getting into the flow when he played, and he played in an altered state. And that's all about mindfulness. And I mean, coaches can train themselves to be mindful and be more mindful with their players, just like you were like, hey, I'm noticing that I don't like some of the way in which I'm acting. I'm going to change that. I'm going to be really mindful about using the word don't. And you switched it up.
Yeah, and just to build off that, obviously Steve Kerr is a coach that's under those, played for Phil Jackson. But the other thing, to coaches, we perceive ourselves as one way. So there's work done by Chris Cushion. So if I perceive myself to be a technical skills coach, but I don't have that technical eye, if I perceive myself to be a coach that asks questions, but then gives players the answers, best thing we can do as coaches, Damien, and everybody listening, is put a video on, record, video yourself coaching, video or record yourself on your iPhone as you're talking, and then think about the interventions we have and think about, was that needed? Was it accurate? Was it kind? But much of coaching is always pointing out what went wrong. And I think we need to be the opposite, not just give kids empty praise and make them praise junkies, but find ways to give words of affirmation. So instead of saying great pass, it might be, hey, the vision you displayed to make that pass was fantastic. And just look at different ways where we can, number one, reflect. Reflect, and then number two is record yourself, and the camera never lies.
It's for people that okay. So I just want to say something about that. That's really interesting to me, because when the Toronto Star, so that's a national newspaper, and W5, which is a TV station, what they did was they looked at the coaching crisis at this school, at St. Michael's University School. And this is where the kids, headmaster asked me to take the testimonies. I took the testimonies. It became this huge story because eventually I had legal duty to report as a teacher, and I realized the headmaster, the chaplain at the school, the athletic director, who herself had reports of abusive conduct, I realized they're not going to do their duty to report. And when that happens, when the administrators aren't doing it, it falls to the teacher. The teacher has to go to the teacher regulation branch by law and report the abuse, even if we hear this information indirectly. So what happened was Toronto Star and W5, they did a national story on this, a huge story on this. I mean, it was on the front page of the newspaper, and then when you opened up the newspaper, it was this entire page and this entire page. That's how big it was. And it wasn't big just because of the school covering up what was happening and actually re-victimizing the students and doing that type of typical behavior on the part of a school. It wasn't that. It was that the commissioner for teacher regulation swept the whole thing under the carpet. He wrote these reports that are full of all this manipulation, all these like literally legal manipulations, and they were all locked down. No one was allowed to see them. This is why it was a national story. But what they did was they filmed the coach. So what's interesting to me is that coach who had himself, he was one of 4 coaches, but one coach was filmed. And people normalize this type of behavior. I think it would be an interesting exercise for the coaches listening to this. Go and look at the Toronto Star story. It's called Teachers Bullying. No, it's called something like Teachers Bullying Athletes. Oh, we'll get the link. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact title.
No problem.
But it's got a video of the coach, and I'd be really interested I'd even love to do a follow-up on this. I'd love you to go and look at the coach, look at how he's treating the players, look how he's acting on the sidelines, and then, you don't get to hear the words, but you hear the words reported by the students of how he actually speaks to them. It was normalized. You look at Mike Rice. Mike Rice, the abuse he was doing was out in public. It was normalized by his culture. And then all of a sudden when ESPN did the practice practice went. So behind the closed doors is always the more intense version. The public version of coaching abuse is a little bit toned down. You can't quite hear the words. It's when you can hear the homophobic slurs matched up with the very violent physical, verbal display put on by the coach. But, you know, on one level, I feel sorry for Mike Rice. I mean, he was doing it in public. He was grabbing his players by the face, just like my son was being grabbed. He was yelling in their face. Nobody was doing anything. They acted like it was the most normal behavior in the world. Just like Durkin at University of Maryland. He's just being hired. Nobody cares that Jordan McNair died on his watch with a huge amount of documentation normalized in our culture. So coaches might not even see that this is actually harmful behavior, and it's not their fault. Normalized.
Yeah, and you know, like I said earlier, we as a club have our 11 human core values, and I think the most difficult thing as a coach is to live those core values, you know, and exemplify them, you know.
Yeah.
So
it's hard as a teacher. I mean, it's hard as a parent. I'm sure I've certainly had moments as a parent. I love my kids more than life itself. I would stand in front of a train for my kids, and if that was going to save them. But that doesn't make me a perfect parent. I have yelled. I have said things I regret. I have behaved in ways that I'm embarrassed to even remember. And I've had to go to my kid and say, I was such a jerk. I'm so sorry. I have a lot of stress going on. This is why I acted that way, and it has nothing to do with you. And I was really being a lousy parent, and I'm really, really sorry. And I've had to do that as a teacher before too. I've apologized to kids if I lost my temper. Kids used to go after me for rolling my eyes. And it's not until I was reading the research that I read that rolling your eyes is totally rude. I just missed it. And here I was. I thought I was so funny. No, but I mean, the difference between the bullying individual and the normal individual who actually doesn't have that unhealthy training from the past is you can see yourself much more clearly, and you can say you're sorry and you want to fix it.
Yeah. So we had a situation just yesterday. It was a 7-year-old boy who came to the wrong training time, and he was training with a couple of kids a couple of years older. And he came to the end of the session, and he came over to me to ask me, can I come to? And I didn't let him finish, and I felt terrible. And he stormed off, you know, being 7, right? And I thought it took a lot of courage for that kid. So I went outside, I found him, he was hiding behind a pillar, his dad was there. And I said, you know what, I need to start by apologizing to you because I didn't let you finish. So how about you share with me what you wanted to share when I rudely interrupted? But before you do that, I need to know, do you accept my apology? And he's like, yes, coach, I do. And I said, I'm so sorry. And I said his name. And then he told me, he says, well, you know, would it be okay? And he was just asking, could I come to this session? And I said to him, let's make a deal. Come to this session. If you do well at this session, come to the session at your own age group. That way you get to be a leader. And we just hashed it out, right? But how often as a parent or as a teacher or as the adult or the power do we turn around and say sorry, right? You know what? I'm so sorry for the way I handled that situation. You know, you deserved better. You know, and as a parent, you know, it's funny to me because I would, you know, we would talk with my wife, who's a special ed assistant, and we would yell at our kids for yelling or smack them for smacking, right? And I'm like, what are we doing? You know, what are we doing? Right? It looks like we have another question that's come in, again from Debbie. It says, just out of curiosity, did you remove your son from the basketball team after the coach's behavior?
Well, what actually happened was the headmaster told all the students that if they gave these testimonies, they would be protected, they would have confidentiality. So they had at least 14 students came forward. I took 8 testimonies, and a parent who's also a lawyer took 6 testimonies. So these all then went to the headmaster. They ranged from students who were in second-year university all the way to 10. They all were corroborating same behaviors, same treatment, same favoritism, humiliation, etc. So the headmaster then interviewed some of them who were on campus, including my son, and the chaplain was there as well. So they had first-hand knowledge from these students about how they were being treated. And so that was where it ended. They had promised all the students, if you can tell us the truth about what's going on, those coaches will not be coaching you next year. This is all documented. I've got it all on email, everything. So the students, of course, trusting their headmaster, trust the chaplain, of course, they came forward, they told what was happening, they gave their written testimonies, they did their, and then the headmaster betrayed them. So he went to the coach, one of the coaches, and he told them, at least 3 of the boys who came forward, which included myself. So at school, all of a sudden, and this is in the spring of 2012, my son and 2 other boys were being publicly humiliated by other teachers who were, you know, thinking that they had been bad kids or whatever. They didn't have the truth, and also other students. So obviously the coach had, or the teacher had gone out and shared this information. So confidentiality was breached. They were getting bullied at school. I was reporting to the headmaster. Really, I was really frustrated by that point, and I was saying, you know, my kid's being bullied at school. Like, what is going on? You promised they would be safe. They spoke up. And then the chaplain sent me a very detailed email saying my son in particular would be protected as long as we just let everything else drop. So they would give my son the satisfaction of not having the coach's coach. They'd be punished, blah, blah, blah. But for me to agree to this situation meant that, first of all, I wouldn't be fulfilling legal duty to report, which I'm really uncomfortable with. And secondly, so I'd be sort of part of this cover up. And then secondly, the students who were in grade 10 who'd come forward, they were going to get exposed to these coaches after my son graduated. And my son was like, no, there's no way. I don't care. I'm not going to somehow sell out these kids to get this deal. Like, no. So at that point, this was the headmaster brought in a lawyer, and he had this lawyer write a report. If he didn't publish it, he wouldn't let the parents read it. Like, we had no idea what the lawyer wrote. So then, and by this point too, we found out he or whomever else at the school was outreaching to hundreds and hundreds of alumni and having them write in and say that these teachers actually were excellent. So again, they breached confidentiality. Nobody should have known what was even going on. That's like, as you know, as a teacher, you're not allowed to do that stuff. But by that point, they then hired another lawyer. They said to the parents, so this guy's going to be much more involved and do this. They then published that report just before grade 12 started for my son. I was still a teacher at the school. I thought that the headmaster was going to do the right thing. And this lawyer's report was published widely by the headmaster. He sent it out to hundreds of people, and it basically positioned the kids who spoke up, and by this point, my son's name is out there. So the kids who spoke up as basically telling lies. So my son had to go back to school in grade 12, not able to play basketball when he was ready, pretty much poised to play college level. He's extremely good player. His coaches, the abusive individuals that were reported on, said so themselves. He had to go back in grade 12. The coaches were put back into their position. So he and 5 other boys refused to play. And he didn't go to his graduation ceremony. He was ostracized by kids. He was bullied by kids in that final year. He barely got through. He went from being on the headmaster's honor roll to he couldn't even write his exams. He didn't go to graduation. It was one of the worst things you've ever seen in your life. However, and at that point, I resigned in protest at the end of that year, but I didn't resign because I needed to be there for the kids that were just being so mistreated by the school. And my son has now graduated from university. He works in the film industry. He's healthy, well. He's very clear on what was done to him and the other kids. He spoke up to national news when most of the kids didn't have the courage to do that, or they were too afraid. And, you know, it's been a long journey, but he's strong and he stood up for the right thing, and he's learned a lot about himself, and he's learned that most people aren't going to ever be upstanders. They can't. They're too afraid. They want to be aligned with power. They aren't going to tell the truth. And I mean, those are tough lessons. Talk about character building. That's character building.
Yeah, absolutely. What a story, and congrats to your son, you know, and to you, right? And your parental unit and the support system that it took to, you know, basically rebuild a human, right? Which is unreal. So this is one of the final questions we have, and this is from Nikolai, my friend from Pennsylvania. He said, what about the way players are treated by other players in games? How do you recommend you support your players and refocus them when they have been shamed or bullied in the middle of the game and your player is starting to give up?
Well, obviously, it's kind of tough in the middle of a game. I think that what you're going to have to do with situations like that is really use practice time, I guess, to build the type of relationships between your players so that that would never happen. I mean, in a perfect world, that's what you'd want to do, obviously. But if it actually unfolded in a game, if I was coaching, I would, regardless of the situation, I'd call a timeout and I'd bring my team together and I would make it very clear that the team lives and dies as a team. And the only way that you're going to even coach or allow them to play is as a team. And you're going to call the game right there in that moment if you see any further behavior. All bullying behaviors are unacceptable among players, including things like blaming. You know, a player should never blame another player for missing a shot or whatever. I mean, or being a goalie and letting in a goal. I mean, that's just, you know, that's bullying behavior. There's no place for shaming, blaming, swearing, ostracizing, none of that stuff. So yeah, it's a tough one for coaches. I mean, in the long run, though, of course, we have to ask ourselves, is winning that particular game as important as giving the kids a life lesson about who you are, what you want to see, who they can be, because you believe that actually they can be so much better than bullying.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nikolai's follow-up question is, what if it's somebody else on the other team? How do you handle that? If it's somebody else, if it's an opponent bullying one of your players.
I think you do the same thing, but faster. I think
well,
you call the game. You instantly call the game. You get the other coach involved. You bring the two teams together, and you do a quick review of the 11 values that you have. I mean, does this align with your values? Because if it doesn't, you'd like to bring it to a halt, because that's not sportsmanship. And sports is all about sportsmanship. So you know, you would never, if you had kids, I mean, if we go back to the classroom example, if you had two classes sitting together and one kid in one class started to abuse a kid in another class, it doesn't fly. It's got to be shut down instantly. That's really, you know, adults have all this power. I wish we could use our power for amazing role modeling moments. I mean, I'm sure if I was in that situation, my heart would be beating and I'd be so anxious, because I would think that the coach would be ready to tear a strip off me, and I would be exposed in front of all the parents and all the kids as stalking play. But you'd still have to find it within yourself, I think, to do that. And yeah, your hands might be shaking while you do it, but at the end of the day, that's the person you want to be in front of young, impressionable people. We got to live it, right? We can't keep saying to kids, you know, going back, Chris, to your point, it's like, if our kids were really responding to adult lessons and how we behave as adults and how they see politics and how they see marriages and how they see teachers and coaches, we wouldn't have an epidemic of bullying, because kids role model how we behave. So we've got to really take a harsh look at ourselves in the mirror as adults and go, we're not doing a good job. Bullying is at epidemic proportions in our youth populations. That's on us. We're the ones that train them. They behave the way we behave. So it's a tough one, but I do think we can do better. I really do.
We've got to hope there's better, right? We've got to hope. So I just wanted to read this quote, and for the coaches, think about this. It says, where there is a storm and you stand in front of a tree, if you look at its branches, you swear it will fall. But if you watch the trunk, you will see its stability. So what I want to say about that is, for me, we can be the stability when everything else is being unstable around us, you know. So I wanted to bring that up. What were your thoughts on that, Jen?
I'm going to sound like a completely way out there, but what it, in all honesty, made me think about is the fact that the word bark for around the trunk of a tree is, in Latin, it's cortex. And the cortex is the trunk of our brains. It's the bark of our brains, and that's why they use that word. It's a thin series of brain cells, essentially. Dr. John Medina says it's the part of our brain that makes us human. So while we share lots of brain behaviors with animals, for example, like fight, flight, and freeze, that type of very deep-seated primal, I've got to survive, we also have the cortex. We've got that bark around the trunk. And if we can constantly tap into that part of ourselves, the deeply human part of ourselves, then we can be our best selves. And what is so interesting about it too is that it's not mature until 24 or 25. So we could argue that the cortex is also what makes us adults. And this conversation is being all about, and all the people that listen in, all of us are adults who want to be our best selves. We want to be that trunk. And I don't want to suggest it's easy. And I know it's really hard, but I think just the fact that we have a community right here talking about it means we can do it. We can do it together.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we can with the research and the work that you've done. So this is how we usually finish our webinars, and you can say yes or no. But I ask a series of questions, and you get one-word answers. So this is really testing the brain. I couldn't tell you which part of the brain it's testing. You don't have to play. I don't want you to feel like you've had to play, but it's quite easy, but also thought-provoking. Are you up for it, Jen?
I'm totally up for it.
Brilliant. So the first question, the first statement is criticism.
And I'm answering
you get a one-word answer. One-word answer.
So you say criticism, and I just give a one-word answer to that?
Yeah.
Cruel.
Cruel. Constructive feedback.
Character.
Brilliant. I just added that one in, by the way. Praise.
Strength.
Affirmation.
Building.
Love it. Good one. Bully.
Hurt.
X. Hurt. Sports.
Power.
Children.
Care.
I had future for that one. I was going to go with future. And then brain.
Miraculous.
Miraculous. I love it. Brilliant. All right. So again, everybody, thanks for joining us. Dr. Jen, I was really nervous about this, right? Because this is uncharted territory, right? The brain. And I remember hearing you on a webinar somewhere, and you said, well, we asked these coaches to name muscles, and they can name muscles all day, but you try and mention 5 parts of the brain, and people just like, and then you've got the myelin, you've got the medulla oblongata, you've got, I remember the water boy, thank goodness he came through for me there. But just different things, right? And it's uncharted territory. And I think when we look at it, the game's not going to change much technically and tactically, but it is going to change so much on the psychosocial side of things, and how we can play our part is so pivotal. And you as a trailblazer with your research and the work that you're doing, I think what we need to do, Dr. Jen, if you're agreeable, is we'll get that article out, we'll get the coaches to watch it, and then maybe we'll get you back for a second one to have discussion on little things that people have tried, whether it's videoing yourself or videoing your sessions, to try and eradicate the game and sports of bullying behaviors. How does that sound?
I would love to do that. That would be fantastic.
Brilliant. Now, is there any questions I should have asked you that I didn't?
What I would like to just end off on is saying that if there are coaches who want to email me, I'm really open to talking about this stuff. If there's coaches that want articles and some of the brain stuff, I work really hard on it. I'm not a neuroscientist, so if I can understand this material and I can try and educate others about what I'm reading in the research, anybody can. It's intimidating for people, but I'm not a neuroscientist and I can do it. So it means everyone can. So I have a ton of articles on my website, which is Neuro Paradigm. As you would know, Chris, one of the things I'm trying to do is change the system by saying we have to leave the paradigm of bullying and abuse, which we've all been trained in. We've been raised in it. It's infiltrated every part of society. So it's going to be hard work, but we can walk away from that paradigm and into a new paradigm that's grounded in neuroscience, which I call Neuro Paradigm, just to give it a new name. So on my website, Neuro Paradigm, there's a ton of articles. I have a new book coming out. I'm waiting to see if I get the publisher that I want. People who want to read that manuscript, I'm happy to send it to them. I'd love to get feedback. So if you don't pull punches, if you think a section's weak, or I could work harder on something, or it's not clear, or you think it's great, please tell me. I just want the research out there. So I work really hard on it, and I'm keen to share it.
Brilliant. And we thank you for sharing sharing it. And we thank you for being with us today and enlightening us and helping the coaches that are on the coaches that will miss this later. But yeah, do you want to share your Twitter handle? I can do all that, share the thing, but to Fraser, he's on the Twitter and very responsive, and that's how we connect with me. So
yeah,
you hear Jen?
No, I'm the
Jen, can you? Okay, everybody, I just want to say thanks to Dr. for joining us. She's brilliant. Oh, she can hear me. Yes, brilliant. Do you want to share your Twitter? I